Today we're going to be talking about the best weapon for every letter in the alphabet. Now if you don't know what that means, we're basically going to be comparing all the weapons that start with a particular letter and try and figure out which one is the best one. Now you might be asking the question, Yui, what is this? What the fuck are you doing? To which I'll ask that exact same question to From Software. What the fuck is going on? Where is my DLC? I can only milk content for so long. Not really, I can actually do this for a while. But for today's video, it's just something fun that I actually wanted to do. And who knows, you might learn something. Anyway, let's just get started. Now, starting off with the letter A. Actually, it was pretty close. It was between the Alabaster's Lord Sword, which is a nice strength-based weapon that actually does get a pretty decent weapon skill and some nice heavy attack damage, or the Anspur Rapier, which I ended up deciding to go with the Anspur Rapier because this is a thrusting sword that does actually get passive Scarlet Rot build-up. Now, Scarlet Rot is actually extremely powerful, does some very good percentile damage over time. Now, the downside to Scarlet Rot is that it doesn't actually scale with any particular stat, so you can't really improve the build-up of it at all. But the good thing about the Anspur Rapier is that you actually can buff and infuse it. So you actually can pair this alongside other types of status effects, whether it be bleed, poison, frost, or you can just have this weapon keen infused and just use rot grease to just have even more Scarlet Rot build up. Now the major downside to the Anspur Rapier is that it does have very poor range and it gets the regular Rapier moveset, so it just gets a bunch of poking attacks, no horizontal swipes at all. So there's not much variety there, but the weapon itself is still very unique. Letter B, Blasphemous Blade, surprise, surprise. The weapon skill is ridiculous, goes extremely far, sends enemies flying, does a lot of damage, gives you health regen on hits, health regen on kills. Weapon gets really good scaling. You get the idea. Now the B letter is actually stacked with a whole bunch of really good weapons. It's arguably the best letter in the entire game because you get weapons like the Bloodhound Fang, Bloody Hellas, Bolt of Gransax, the Black Knife, and the Bandit's Curve Sword. All of these are just S tier weapons. So confirmed, the letter B is the best letter in the entire game. Now getting into the letter C, which is actually also pretty decent. You get some good weapons like the Claimant's Harpoon and the Claymore, but I ended up going with the Cross Naginata, which is a spear, which gets a very unique moveset, inherent bleed, amazing range, and being that it is a spear, you actually get an amazing power sense moveset, and you can pair it alongside another bleed spear and get one of the best builds in the entire game. But even just two-handed is still perfectly fine because that light attack combo is actually extremely good. Now getting into the Ds, this is definitely another S tier letter as you get things like the Dragon Halberd, Dragon King's Cragblade, Death's Poker, Death Ritual Spear, but obviously it's going to go to the Dark Moon Greatsword, which is definitely a top 2 weapon in this game alongside the Blasphemous Blade. Extremely good scalings, you get good frost build up, and its weapon skill turns your heavy attacks into free projectile attacks to do 35 stance damage, a whole bunch of frost build up, and can just melt enemies for days, and it obviously doesn't consume any FP because it's a heavy attack. But yeah, I'm sure I talked about the Dark Moon Greatsword enough. Now getting into the letter E, this one also actually has some very decent options like the Executioner's Great Axe, the S-Stock, Erdsteel Dagger, Eleonora's Pole Blades, but the Envoy's Longhorn is just better than all of those things because its weapon skill, Bubble Shower for 16 FP, just melts enemies so well, and it can actually do up to 91 stance damage if every single one of those bubbles hit. As you can see, against large bosses, it just melts them extremely quickly, but even against small enemies, it actually can still output some decent damage. And being that it is a Great Hammer, you actually get a very decent moveset, you get some very good poise damage. Now the obvious downside is that yes, it actually does do holy damage, but the weapon skill does that much damage that it doesn't even matter. The letter F, we ended up going with the Falling Star Beastjaw. Now the Flamberge is probably like a close second, but the Falling Star Beastjaw gets a very solid projectile attack, staggers pretty well, gets some nice damage, goes pretty far. Now it's no longer as good as it used to be as it did like ridiculous poise damage, but nowadays you're just not going to poise break anything. But not even talking about the weapon skill, just the weapon itself is still actually extremely good. Now it is a colossal weapon, so its moveset isn't that great, but it actually does do piercing damage, which is arguably the best damage type in the entire game, and it gets absolutely ridiculous range on top of that. So I definitely think it's the best starting with the letter F. Now getting into the G, this letter is just absolutely stacked with so many great weapons that it's not even funny. Guardian Sword Spear, Great Stars, Grave Scythe, Godskin Stitcher, Godskin Peeler, Glintstone Chris, Giant Crusher, Geezer's Will. All of these weapons are probably like A S tier weapons, but for me it came down to 2 different weapons, the Godslayer's Greatsword or the regular Greatsword, the Colossal Sword, to which I just ended up going with the Greatsword because I just think that's going to be like the best strength weapon in the entire game, probably right behind the Starfist, as this thing just gets ridiculous range. It obviously gets a really nice moveset because it's a Colossal Sword, and you can equip a whole bunch of different types of Ash of War options onto this thing. My favorite being Giant's Hunt, but Lion's Claw is still really good as well. But the fact that it just gets the most range and the most damage out of all the Colossal Swords is the main reason for me as to why it did win, but the Godslayer's Greatsword is definitely a close second. Now as for the letter H, I went with the Halo Scythe. Now this one wasn't really that close for me. Other competitors would have been the Hand of Millennia or the Health and Steeple, but I think that the Halo Scythe, this is a clear runaway winner, as it is a Reaper, so it gets a decent moveset. You get inherent bleed, but obviously the best thing about the Halo Scythe is its weapon skill, Miquella's Ring of Light, which can spam a whole bunch of projectiles that go very fast, stagger very well, do some nice damage, and you can consecutively cast it over and over again. Now yes, it does do holy damage, which a lot of bosses are resist to, and this weapon actually does get a descaling in Faith despite its weapon skill scaling of Faith, which is unfortunate, but the projectile can still be doing amazing damage, hence it still being the best weapon that starts with a letter H. Now, getting into the letter I, this one is not going to be as strong as a letter, as probably the best options out there would definitely be the Iron Greatsword, Iron Cleaver, and the Iron Ball, of which the Iron Ball is probably going to end up winning this one. Now, yes, the Iron Ball is directly outclassed by the Starfist as it just does more damage and just more bleed, but both of these weapons are just absolutely ridiculous because those heavy attacks come out so fast and just do ridiculous damage for a decent amount of stance damage. So basically the way to use this is a spam charged heavy attacks the entire time. Now, the only downside I can say about this is that fist weapons don't really get many Ash of War options and they have very, very poor range. So I guess some types of bosses, you're just going to have a very terrible time trying to hit them. But the amount of damage output you can get with these things is ridiculous. Now, as for the letter J, there is literally only one weapon and one ballista that actually start with the letter J. So yeah, obviously the Jawbone Axe is going to be the winner by default. Now this weapon actually isn't even too bad. It is actually an axe that gets strike damage, which is very unique because most axes only get standard damage. Now for me, this will just not be as good as a hammer in most cases because hammers would just end up having strike damage as well, have the exact same moveset, but just get way more poise damage. But one benefit that axes do have over hammers is that they get more Ash of War options. So if there was like a particular Ash of War that you wanted to use like Spinning Slash or Sword Dance, then maybe the Jawbone Axe is the pick for you because it still gets a very decent strength scaling at that. Now for the letter K, this one is also pretty weak. There is only the Knight's Greatsword and the Katana, of which I just went with the Knight's Greatsword because it gets a very good light attack combo with those nice mix up of vertical and horizontal swipes. Now this weapon just works the exact same way as the Banished Knight's Greatsword, but I think the main difference being is that the Knight's Greatsword just gets a bit more range, whereas the Banished Knight's Greatsword just gets more damage. Now the Katana is actually a pretty decent weapon as well, but the Katana is actually very similar to a Claw in the fact that it actually does get that piercing damage, very similar moveset, actually gets 110 crit multiplier. But Claws are just going to be better in my opinion because they all get inherent bleed and they tend to have slightly faster movesets at that as well. Now for the letter L, this one is between two different weapons. It was the Lord Sworn Straight Sword and the Lance. Now I ended up going with the Lance because this one is the only Great Spear in the entire game that actually can be infused. And Great Spear is actually a pretty decent weapon class. Have some nice range, you get poking damage. You can actually attack while holding up a shield and you get some very decent Ash of War options. But I think the best thing about the Lance is its scalings. It just gets amazing scalings on every single infusion. It actually performs really well. But the Lord Sworn Straight Sword is still going to be a close second because it gets really good base damage, 110 crit multiplier, good range, and it is a straight sword so it gets a good moveset and good Ash of War options. Now getting into the letter M, this is just another S tier letter that's just stacked with a whole bunch of good weapons. Magma Blade, Magmorum Scale Sword, Mariah's Executioner Sword, Marika's Hammer, Misericord, Moonveil, Morgoth's Curse Sword. All of these are probably S tier weapons, but obviously the Mogwyn's Sacred Spear is probably going to be the best amongst them, with Moonveil probably just being slightly behind it. But Mogwyn's Sacred Spear is obviously another great spear, gets amazing range, get that inherent bloodlust build up, and its weapon skill just absolutely just shreds enemies for days and does ridiculous bloodlust build up. And if you spec into a lot of that arcane, it will just end up doing more damage and more bloodlust build up, and it can just trivialize a majority of the game. It's that good. Definitely is a top 5 weapon in this game. Now getting into the letter N, there actually isn't too many weapons in this letter, but all of them are actually pretty decent. The best ones being the Knight Rider's Glaive and the Nagakiba, of which I actually ended up going with the Nagakiba, which is a katana, so it's going to get an amazing moveset, and this thing just gets absolutely ridiculous range. Just like stupidly dumb range. There are like some spears out there that don't even get as much range as the Nagakiba. And obviously it's a katana, so it gets passive bleed, you get amazing weapon skill options, and the Nagakiba also gets that nice poking attack moveset with its heavy attacks. But the Knight Rider's Glaive is definitely going to be a close second because it gets an S scaling in strength, amazing range, and amazing damage. Now getting into the letter O, there are actually some decent options. The Omen Cleaver and the Ornamental Straight Sword, both very solid, but the Ordovus's Greatsword is definitely going to be the best one on here. Now this is like a mainly strength-based weapon, of which will just mainly do physical damage. Now yes, it does do that split holy damage, but if you just go all into strength, it would mainly do physical. But this thing's weapon skill, Ordovus's Vortex, which for 15 FP, you can actually do a pretty high damaging small AoE attack that can do some nice stance damage, or you can just fully charge it to make it do even more damage and just do over 80 stance damage, which is just absolutely ridiculous. It actually turns into one of the best poise breaking weapons in the entire game. And pairing this thing alongside the correct talismans can just make it shred almost everything in the entire game. Now for the letter P, this one isn't like the strongest letter in the entire game, and this thing actually did come between two different weapons, the pickaxe and the pike. Now the pike just gets the most range in the entire game, and it is a spear, so it gets a nice moveset, but I actually ended up going with the pickaxe, which is a great hammer that actually does some piercing damage, which piercing damage is probably the best damage type in the entire game, and great hammers get the most poise damage in the entire game, and the pickaxe in particular actually does get a unique heavy attack, so just spamming those charged heavy attacks can just do ridiculous damage. Now the unique thing about the pickaxe is that it cannot be power stance with other great hammers, but it can be power stance with great axes, So a good pairing with the pickaxe is having it alongside the rusted anchor, because you can only get one of these things per playthrough, and you can just spam those jumping attacks or light attacks and they'll both do piercing damage and just both do ridiculous damage on top of that. Now the rusted anchor will just end up having some more Ash of War options and has higher damage potential in general, but the pickaxe still has its specific use because it actually does do more poise damage than the rusted anchor does do. But speaking of which, letter R, the rusted anchor, this thing is just as insane as the pickaxe, probably even more so, because the damage output is just ridiculous compared to all the other strength weapons in the entire game. Actually can output the most damage compared to some of the other weapons per hit, because obviously piercing damage does some nice counter attack damage paired alongside the spirit talisman, and you're just doing so much more damage, it's not even funny. Now the letter R actually does have some other decent weapons, like the Reduvia, Regalia, Rivers of Blood, Rose's Axe is also extremely good, and the Ruin's Greatsword probably being the second best one on this list, but the rusted anchor is definitely one of the best strength weapons in the entire game. Now for the letter S, this one is definitely the hardest one to actually choose from, because there's a lot of weapons that begin with the letter S and plenty of S tier options as well. You have the Scavenger's Curve Sword, the Serpent Hunter, Siluria's Tree, also the Star Scourge Greatsword, just to name a few S tier options. But for me, it came down to 3 different ones: the Sword of Night and Flame, the Sacred Relic Sword, and the Starfist. Now I ended up going with the Starfist because I think this one just has the highest ceiling, because the damage output is just probably better than all the other weapons. Because as I talked about with the Iron Balls, this is basically the exact same thing, but just slightly better, because you just get more damage and you just get inherent bleed. And then pairing this thing alongside Royal Knot Resolve or Cragblade and just spamming those heavy attacks can just do ridiculous damage. But the reason why the Sacred Relic Sword and the Sword of Night and Flame were actually close behind is because they're just a lot easier to use, because projectile attacks, in my opinion, just cheese the entire game. You don't even have to dodge attacks half the time, especially with a Sacred Relic Sword. You could just sit at the back of the map and just keep spamming that weapon skill over and over again. Honestly, my easiest playthrough in the entire game is when I was doing a playthrough only using the weapon skill of the Sacred Relic Sword. It was just ridiculous. But the Sword of Night and Flame is actually also good, because it's the only faith and intelligence based weapon in the entire game, and it can actually still output this ridiculous damage. But yeah, all these weapons are amazing, but I'm still going to go with the Starfist. Now as for the letter T, this is definitely going to be one of the weaker letters in the entire game. I honestly didn't even know what I wanted to go with. It was between the Thorned Whip, the Tree Spear, and the Twin Knight Swords, of which I ended up going with the Tree Spear because at least that one had a pretty cool heavy attack. But I would never use the Tree Spear over something like the Siluria's Tree, because that weapon is also a holy based Great Spear, but it just gets the better scalings and it gets the much better weapon skill, because Tree Spear only gets stuck with Sacred Order, which one is not that unique and is not even that good as well. But the cool thing about the Tree Spear is that it actually can be buffed as well, despite it actually not being able to get infused. I don't know why it can't be infused. I definitely feel like it should be, but they just didn't allow it to for some reason. But the weapon overall is actually not too bad. Now for the letter U, there's only 2 options, the Uchigatana and the Urumi, of which I actually ended up going with the Urumi. Now the Uchigatana is still an amazing weapon, but I just think it's directly outclassed by the Nagakiba, because that weapon gets very similar damage, but just way more range and arguably the better moveset as well. But as for the Urumi, there's just nothing like it in the entire game, because it's a whip that does slashing damage, and it gets a very unique heavy attack to where it just like fully extends. It just has ridiculous range and gets some very nice damage in a nice poke. So pairing this alongside some heavy attack types of items can make for an amazing build. But another good thing about the Urumi is that it gets an S scaling in dexterity. So pairing this alongside certain types of Ashes of War that scale off dexterity, whether it be like Thunderbolt or Lightning Ram, it can make it output a lot of damage. Now whips themselves still kind of suck. You can't do critical attacks. You can't get good poise damage. You get pretty poor Ash of War options. But the Urumi is actually very fun. Now for the letter V, this one also isn't the most strongest letter as well. Weapons like the Vulgar Militia Saw and the Veteran's Prosthesis are okay, but the best weapon is definitely going to be the Venomous Fang, which is a claw-based weapon that actually can get the most damage out of all the other claws. Now the difference being is that this one actually gets poison build up instead of the bleed build up. Also gets the least amount of range out of all the claws, and it also doesn't get that 110 crit multiplier like the other claws do. But what makes this amazing is that it doesn't just get regular poison, it gets deadly poison build up, which is just like a better version of poison. And you actually can infuse and buff it. So you actually compare this alongside other types of status effects, whether it be bleed or frost. But I actually like to go with an occult infusion, which gives a very good arcane scaling, because poison actually does scale alongside arcane. So you can just have like this ridiculous poison build up, proc poison extremely quickly, and being that deadly poison doesn't last that long, you can just constantly keep procking it over and over again and proc the buffs of things like the Mushroom Crown and the Kindred of Rot Exaltation, and you've got yourself an amazing build. Now for the letter W, this one is just not even close. It is the Wing of Astel. There are some other decent weapons that start with the letter W, like the Watchdog Staff, the Warped Axe, and the Warhawk Talon. But the Wing of Astel is just absolutely cracked. This thing is just ridiculous. It is by far the best poise-breaking weapon in the entire game. Its charged heavy attacks is a projectile attack that does really good damage, and actually does just as much stance and posture damage as a colossal weapon, which is insane. And its weapon skill, Nebula, for only 20 FP, can just output a bunch of damage extremely quickly in a very quick animation, and can do like upwards of like 60 stance damage depending on how many of those like projectiles actually do hit. So just in combination with the weapon skill and the heavy attacks, you can just poise break enemies extremely quickly, and it's not even funny. But even just talking about the weapon itself, it gets amazing scaling, so very good dexterity and intelligence scaling. It also deals boosted damage to gravity type enemies, and the total overall AR is actually pretty high as well. So this thing is definitely a top 3 intelligence weapon in the entire game. Now lastly, for the letter Z, because there is no weapons that start with the letter X or Y, or even Q at that matter, From Software definitely get on that for the DLC. But for the letter Z, there's only 2 weapons, the Zamor Curved Sword and the Zweihander, both of which are actually pretty decent. The Zamor Curved Sword actually gets a very high damaging weapon skill that can actually proc Frost faster than almost anything in the entire game. It's also very cheap with a quick animation, but unfortunately the Zamor Curved Sword gets a very poor light attack combo. It looks very unique, but compared to all the other curved great swords, it's just like a lot slower. It also gets bad range, and it doesn't get an intelligence scaling, so you can't really pair it alongside other types of spells. So I'm actually going to go with this Zweihander in this one, because this thing gets amazing range, really good damage, and compared to all the other colossal swords, it actually is the lightest and it has the least amount of requirements. So if you actually wanted to use yourself like a big boy sword that does some nice poise damage, have some very good range earlier on in the game where you don't really have much equipment load, the Zweihander is probably going to be the best option. But probably the best thing about the Zweihander is its heavy attack. It gets a very nice poke, which colossal swords already get pokes with a crouching attack, but obviously heavy attacks will just result in just much more damage. And as I said multiple times, poking attacks are amazing because piercing damage is probably just the best damage type in the entire game. So yes, the Zweihander can get the best weapon for the letter Z. Anyway, that's that. It's done. Useless video out of the way. As always, please do like and subscribe because I have more useless videos coming along the way. Just milking content until the DLC comes. Also, do follow me on Twitch as well because I actually am live there every single day doing some challenge runs. Anyway, see you guys around. Bye.